Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs series at the crossroads of religion and life. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues in the area in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Join us now for this week's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. It's good business. That's not only a common expression in the world of commerce, it's also the title of a book on the subject of business ethics. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church.
And I'm Ruth Landsberg of Congregation Agudas Achim, your co-hosts for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
And today we're pleased to have with us the co-author of that book, Robert C. Solomon, professor of business ethics and philosophy at the University of Texas. Dr. Solomon's work extends far beyond our locality, and we welcome you to the show today.
Thank you very much.
And being in the School of Philosophy, I've wondered how you happened to get tied up with business ethics along the way.
Well, I've been working in business ethics for over 10 years now. It was the late 70s, and I was getting increasingly disturbed by what I heard and saw, and especially heard from my students. There was a lot of talk about the new prosperity. At the same time, there was an enormous amount of talk about selfishness, greed, doing whatever you have to, and the kind of survival mentality that grew through the 80s. And I became concerned.
So it was a personal concern that led you to expand your academic coverage, it sounds like.
That's right. I'm not even sure it was an expansion of the academic coverage. It's almost as if I got into it from a separate door. I've worked a lot in ethics in an academic setting, but that didn't prepare me for the sort of practical concern and theory that I needed to learn in order to do this.
Mm-hmm. Practical, I mean, what are examples of that?
For the last 10 years, I've spent a good deal of time actually working with corporations, spending time just talking to business people, seeing what's going on, sharing some of their problems.
I understand that you've been hired as a consultant to work with businesses in terms of how to...
I've been doing that a long time. I've actually set up ethics programs for quite a few corporations now.
What sort of response do you get when you go into a big corporation and say, I'm here to talk about business ethics?
Well, it's fascinating how it's changed. 10 years ago, when I first started doing it, it was pure cynicism. And there were all the jokes. Business ethics, isn't that a contradiction in terms? And it must be a very short course and all of that. Now, everyone knows exactly why I'm there. They accept it. They welcome it. It's been a complete turnaround in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm. So that has been due to what factors, do you think?
Well, first, publicity. Secondly, I think the ups and downs of the economy have made people think quite a bit about what's good business and what's not. Certainly, the students have changed. I find just in the last 5 years, partly because of a tighter market, my students are not any longer so adamant about making $100,000 or $150,000 a year, or much less $1 million, and going into investment banking. Now my students are perfectly happy with the idea of being social workers and educators and making a reasonable $35,000, $40,000 a year. It's a real change.
So diminished expectations on the part of the students that you work with.
Well, that makes it sound as if it's negative, as if students expect less. I'd like to say that they expect more. They expect more of themselves. They expect now, in their words, to do something that contributes to meaningful life. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I heard 10 years ago.
So let's push it back a little further then. What accounts for their change in attitude?
Well, as I say, I'm sure the market is some of it. I think some of it is sheer disgust with some of the excesses of the mid-'80s. I'm sure some of it, too, is the shock of seeing, in effect, Wall Street and a good many industries virtually explode a few years ago. The high rollers turned out to be frauds, and I think that's affected a great many of them. They learn a lot from what they see on television, and when you see heroes exploded, it makes an impression.
Ruth, you were a student at the university at the time that Bob was offering these courses. What was your perception of how this was coming across to your contemporaries at that time?
I think in the last few years there's been a real change, even from my freshman year through my senior year. In talking to my contemporaries, there's a big shift for, I'm going to change the world and I'm going to do it from the ground up. And that's even a little different from the mentality as a freshman that I think was coming out of the mid-'80s when I started school.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's, when I graduated, I was right on the, you know, on the head of that pack, looking for the nonprofit agency that I was going to become a part of, and did become a part of, and try and affect some changes. And you see that pretty typically with students in the last few years?
All the time now. And this is including the business students. I teach about half business students and half philosophy and liberal arts students. And the business students tell me too. I mean, they're no longer interested primarily in making as much money as possible. They're thinking more, this sounds so simple, but they're thinking more in terms of, for example, having families and having the time to spend with them. They're thinking more in terms of having some leisure time to do things other than just work. They're thinking about what their work is going to amount to. And a lot of the business ethics messages of the mid-'80s, which were then rather quaint, now have been taken quite seriously. Little lessons like, how would you feel explaining to your children or to your parents exactly what it is you do? And if you read Michael Lewis and Liar's Poker and the story, you know, of Wall Street in the mid-'80s, that would have been greeted with a kind of laugh. But now students take it very seriously.
Yeah. I have a hunch, too, that what's happening at the university level is reflecting the broader feeling in society that, I mean, we've been through the Michael Millikan scandal, where it's been so clear that business ethics has just been completely ignored, and people out, you know, the devil take the hindmost kind of attitude, and that that has had its effect at the university, but it's also probably had its effect at the corporate structures as well, to ask you to come in and lead seminars in this and help business be good in terms of that somehow that you can reconcile making a profit. It's good business and profit-wise and ethically. And this is, I understand, in your book here, you point out how ethics is the key to improved performance in business for your company and for yourself.
And in many ways, it seems counterintuitive to some of the premises of business, just the idea of going for the profit, go for broke.
The bottom line?
Is that
Only if you have a very small mind, because in a way, the paradigm of business that we're all taught is the single deal. And you take that single deal and you get as much as you can out of it. And then it's as if you skip town or you disappear or something. But the truth is that most of the businesses in the United States and everywhere else are ongoing enterprises. They depend on repeated clientele, not just one-shot buyers. They therefore depend on a reputation. And when they don't do right by one customer, word gets around fast. So I think it's only when you think in terms of the kind of one-night stand that the push to just make a profit and everything else, forget about it, makes any sense. As soon as you start thinking about going into business for any period of time and staying in one place, then all the ethical considerations really prove that you're not going to get away with much.
A long-term investment.
That's right.
So honesty is the best policy. That's the old adage.
Sure.
And you're saying that in modern day circumstances that's proving up, even in our more complex society. Same principles.
I think it's always proved. There's a sense in which business ethics isn't new. It's been around as long as business has been around. And as I point out in the book, there have been some radical changes in the very nature of business in the past couple hundred years, but in a sense, people, of course, have always been buying and selling houses and swapping foodstuffs and growing vegetables and selling them and so on. And along with that has been a concern about what's fair and when you're cheating people and what a bargain is. And you find ancient authors in all the old religions, and you find some of the ancient Romans writing rather extensively about, you know, classic things. If someone's trying to buy your house and you know the roof leaks but it hasn't rained for a few months, do you have an obligation to tell them? And that goes all the way back. So my sense is that that sense of it's important to do business in the right way has always been around with us.
So the economics really do change. That's something that you were saying earlier. Do you find that the sense in the business community based on the economic well-being of a country or a city, is that really reflected in people's attitude toward being more ethical or not telling someone about the leaks in the roof if they just can't sell their home?
Well, in a number of different ways. On the one hand, yes, of course. But in another sense, it's because of the kind of anonymity in our society and the fact that, for example, you can move. I mean, when you were talking about most village, town, even small city life throughout history, people weren't about to sort of up and leave unless things got very bad. But if you have a bad business deal in Austin, you can always move to Houston or Dallas or Chicago, and that changes the perception. So part of what I'm afraid of, and part of, I think, what we're trying to cope with now is the possibility of cheating people and not being honest has increased more than ever before. And what we're trying to find is ways of convincing people that the possibility isn't something that should be followed.
Okay, well, let's take the difficulties, or at least the complexities that you're talking about in the modern world. Mobility, you can be up and leaving. Anonymity, you can lose yourself in various ways.
Right.
And that encourages taking shortcuts or just cheating folks.
Well, it makes it possible. I'm not sure it encourages it. I mean, the ancients had a fairly sensible view towards most fly-by-night businesses. They wouldn't let them in the city. You had markets and merchants outside the city walls. They came and they went, and nobody was surprised if they got cheated, but that wasn't a major part of life. Now businesses move to center stage. I mean, downtown in every city in the United States, basically that's where you find your primary businesses. And so the picture has changed. And part of what's changed is that we're much more dependent on business, and so in one sense our demand for business ethics is that much stronger.
So the need for it has increased. That has perhaps offset to some extent the circumstances that make it more easier to cheat. I mean,
Right.
the extent to which people suddenly realize we have to apply certain standards here if we're going to survive as a society, not just as a corporation.
That's right. I mean, one of the points I always make when I give seminars, if you think of almost any business, there are a few exceptions, but almost any business, you think about how few problems or scandals there have to be before the whole industry gets threatened. I mean, banks are an obvious example. It only takes the collapse of one bank to send the whole national banking system into a tizzy. There's a sense in which the trust has to be absolute, and people will be cynical about bankers and they'll be criticizing the big banks, but nevertheless, there's got to be a system of ethics in place there, even for the system to work at all. Now, the exceptions, I mean, if you're talking about, for example, an isolated brake shop, people don't usually have to get new brakes on their cars more than once every 10 years or so. So brake shops can sometimes be dishonest because they don't get repeat business. But if you're talking about a bank, or if you're talking about most of the industries that most of us know, they either do repeat business with the same customers, or they do business in such a way that they have to establish trust to survive. And that's what's changing. And I think the mistake is that we still tend to think of business, as I said, on the single deal. And it's that kind of paradigm that gets us in trouble.
But don't you find that as some of these businesses, using a brake shop, for example, there are now national chains of brake shops where
And that's why.
you can be held accountable. And it
right.
seems to me that as the system enlarges and as the centralized, ancient walled city becomes more of a global community, the systems have expanded with it to some extent. We have federal regulatory commissions and all these sort of things. Do you find that they're still as efficient as building a wall around a city and saying only good businessmen allowed?
Well, you just introduced another element, and that is the whole question of governmental regulation. Let's leave that apart for a moment. The reason you get, for example, national chains is pretty clear. I used to do a lot of driving back and forth cross country, and you'd sort of pull off the highway and go into a truck stop or a coffee shop, and you had no idea what you were going to be walking into. And so a couple bright people named Howard Johnsons and McDonald's and others essentially introduced standardized truck stops, is what it amounts to. And you knew, no matter what part of the country you're in, exactly what you were getting. brake shop's exactly the same thing. I don't know who invented this sort of standardized brake shop, but it was answering the same kind of need. In a sense, to sort of go right to the heart of the subject, you're selling trust. And that's what business is about these days.
Well, I want to play the devil's advocate with you just a bit,
Okay.
because having worked in church situations where business people are wrestling with ethical dilemmas, and they come and they say things like this: it's not a matter of black or white,
True.
it's a matter of gray.
Right.
And sometimes it's a matter, it seems like, of survival. If I am in a tight competitive market, a vicious competitive market, if I'm coming up against competitors that are not just willing to undercut, me, and I don't begin to undercut, if I don't begin to cheat, I can't survive.
Okay.
So be a little
Two-pronged
pastoral
response.
here.
Okay. First, I find that the logic usually goes the other way. That it's when things are very affluent and the deals are wild and woolly, that's when people get carried away and forget about the rules. It was the mid-'80s when there was apparent affluence all over. That's when you got the huge scandals. My sense is that when people are in a crunch, they don't cheat. That they're trying very sincerely to find the best solution, which is why they go to you. So I think we tend to feel that the survival metaphor explains a lot. That when people are pressed to the wall and they've got to survive, that's when they get in trouble. I don't think that's true. I think if you're talking about most businesses, it's when they feel that everything's open, that anything goes. That's when the real trouble starts. Now, the other question is, survival as what? I mean, one of the things that's happened in the United States in the last 20 years, and whether this is good or bad is something we can debate, but that is bankruptcy has become relatively painless. Now, obviously, it's very painful to the people that go through it, but it no longer means, as it used to, a ruined life. So one can say very clearly that when you talk about survival, are you talking about survival as a business? Well, your business might fail, and yet you'll be in perfectly good shape to start another one next year. On the other hand, if you're talking about your survival as a human being with integrity, if you ruin that, then you really aren't going to survive.
So as part of your job to lift up a broader definition or a deeper definition of survival, that you have to help people make the choice of who they want to be as a human being, as distinct from just surviving biologically.
Yeah, and I mean, people do this all the time. You see it on Sundays. My sense is that people have the values, but what happens when they are pressed, it's like when you're in any game that's very hard fought and very tense, you get tunnel vision, and sometimes you forget what you obviously know.
It brings to mind a lot of images of Darwinism and natural selection for a business or for a person.
Right. And it seems to me the main lesson of Darwinism, which we often forget, is that cooperation is the best evolutionary strategy.
It's gotten lost,
Excellent
hasn't it? That cooperation is more the name of the game, even in the natural world, than competition.
Of course. Of course.
Well, I also have to tell you that one of the resources that I think is involved in the religious community is distinct from just getting up in the pulpit and saying, do the right thing as often as you can, or preferably all the time, and instead of generalities, I think to recognize the dilemmas that people are in, and that we can't come out of these gray areas sometimes with feeling as good about it as we'd like to.
Sure.
That we have to accept the need for forgiveness. I mean, that's the factor that we have to make new beginnings in all kinds of ways, and including in our business life. And then I think the sense of being part of a community that can support people in the midst of those dilemmas.
Right,
We had
essential.
a business ethics breakfast for people in the church who were helping each other figure out, well, it may not be that this is your only alternative. Here are some other ways to look
Right.
at it.
And I think that all the religions really offer some framework in which to to consider the ethical dilemmas. There's certainly a real detailed and specific framework in Judaism that addresses all sorts of issues. And I think some of the most wonderful sermons I've heard from my rabbi have been a really nice, tight interpretation of today's events and some Talmudic teaching that gives you a real nice framework, a worldview from which to address a certain issue. It helps you break it apart for yourself.
Well, I think the framework is very important. I also think the community is very important. And a lot of it is just appreciating, as you put it, how dilemmas are painful and there isn't a perfect resolution. And I think a lot of the problem, in a funny way, it's a kind of ethical laziness, that people want to think in terms of black and white, and if they can't come out of something squeaky clean, they talk as if it doesn't matter how they come out of it. But a lot of it is trying to see the best of several perhaps not very attractive solutions. One of the things I do in my seminars is give people practice when they're not on the line to try and work their way through cases, and cases which often I have them make up from their own experience, but work through cases and say, okay, now what would you do if? And so in a sense, they're already predisposed to give certain kinds of answers and to provide certain kinds of solutions to cases that haven't happened yet, but very well might.
Can you give us an example of a case study that you did?
Well, I mean, it all depends on the business. In banking, I've always got questions. For example, someone's a loan officer and they have a client they've worked with for years, and suddenly there are new rules that come through the bank, new higher levels of collateral and so on, which this old trusted client can't meet. And so the loan officer suddenly finds that here's somebody who has made his or her payments for years, is obviously dependable, is a friend of the bank, and yet the new rules say no more loans. What do you do? Well, there's going to be some painful adjustment no matter what you do, but being able to use your moral imagination, figure out ways of dealing with, for example, the bank itself, ways of dealing with a customer, that's the sort of thing people don't like to think about beforehand, but obviously it's the sort of thing they have to think about.
That's probably the hardest part I've found, is that I had a real luxury at the university of thinking about issues and having time to even work my way deeply into the gray and think about what I would do. And I'm finding, as a very, very young person in the business world, that there's so many simultaneous factors affecting every decision I make that it's downright confusing. I'm thinking constantly, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? But the phone is ringing and someone's sitting in front of me waiting for an answer, and I don't even know what the problem is.
Right.
You're feeling that the pressure of the job makes it more difficult. I mean, because you don't have the luxury of just sitting back and
Because you're sitting right like this with somebody, and you're thinking, is this clean, or is this an ethical dilemma? Do I need time to think about this? Should I ask this person to step outside? And that's quite new for me.
Right.
And it's exciting in some ways, because I'm having a lot more opportunities to exercise my own little personal ethical code, but it's a little frightening.
And what makes
It's
it
a lot
particularly
different.
hard is that these get incremental, so that you give someone just a little bit when you don't know what they're really asking for, but it sounds reasonable. And then they ask for a little bit more, and it
Right.
still sounds kind of reasonable. And it's only weeks or months or sometimes years down the line when you realize they've got you.
I got taken,
That's right.
and that's a bad feeling. It's a bad feeling.
One thing that in our closing minutes here I'd like to raise up is some of the work that's been done in the ecumenical community about business ethics. There's a fellow named Robert Batchelder who for a number of years worked out of the Detroit Industrial Mission and wrote case studies that were made available to business and to unions and to, as well as church people, in a variety of settings, and made some discoveries that were of interest to me, like when there was a war going on price cutting, that it could only go so far before somehow it had to rectify itself. That if the system was going to survive, people were going to have to start playing it straight again. It almost makes you think that there is the good business practice is built into the very fabric of existence.
Oh, I think they're the ground rules. Or to change the metaphor, I think very often we take mechanistic views of business, and of course the whole traditional market was a kind of mechanism. But if you take an organic image, which is what you're alluding to here, there's a kind of homeostasis, a kind of self-correction to it. And if you see that all businesses and consumers and communities are ultimately interdependent, then things can only get so far out of shape before they've got to get back into shape if they're going to survive at all. And ultimately, I think survival in the good sense, namely having a healthy, happy community, is something that ultimately drives us all.
I was interested, too, in your mentioning a person like the head of the Cummins Motor Company, who was, remind me of his name.
Miller.
Miller?
Miller.
Yeah. Who was at one time the president of the National Council of Churches, and he read his Greek New Testament every day before he went to work. And he really tried to put his ethics into practice in regard to a company that was making, J. Irwin Miller, making a profit.
Very good profit, too.
And yet he wasn't being self-righteous or wearing his religion on his sleeve, but it just came naturally to him.
It's a very special resource that you have in your own religion. It's something that I've had with me all my life, and that I'm just now finding is a real gift, that here I have something that's going to help me get through these decisions.
And would you say you caught that more than it was taught to you?
Wow, that's a big question. Was it caught or was it taught? A little of each, probably. I mean, some of it was taught, and then I had to catch it.
In
At some
30
point.
seconds, Bob, is it caught or taught?
Oh, well, it's both. I mean, I think they're both the wrong metaphors. I think you are raised with values. You are raised with examples. You are, by the time you are very young, already building prototypes about how a good person should behave. And what we do in business ethics or in religion is simply remind people what those values are and keep them from getting the kind of tunnel vision that doesn't let them see.
Okay, well, you have reminded us of a great deal here today, and we really appreciate your being with us. And we're glad to have you folks look in on it with us as well. And having focused on this, would like to also welcome you back next week to our next edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Ruth?
Thanks for joining us. We hope we'll see you next week.
Peace be
Peace.
with you.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.